So you've got your 1936 first series target model, Colt Woodsman. You've taken it all apart, removed all the pins, trying to get to all those nooks and crannies because you really want to do a good job cleaning it. And, well, now what do you do? So, in today's video, we're going to take a look at just that. This is a Colt Woodsman in its fully disassembled configuration. Almost completely disassembled. The sights have not been removed, and the main hammer spring is still in the housing. That has not been taken apart all the way. It's not uncommon for people to get these apart, and like most things, people taking things apart are generally much easier than putting them together. So today we're going to do a reassembly of a Colt Woodsman, which has been completely disassembled, and show you how that's done. A couple of the main features here. We have the trigger spring. This would be the trigger pin. This is the spring that basically resets the Sear. The hammer spring is located in this housing here. This is also the assembly and disassembly piece which holds it all together. The magazine, of course, the grip and the grip screws. This is the Sear right here, and there's the Sear pin. This is the hammer strut, which transfers the energy from the hammer spring here to the hammer. That pin is what will hold the strut into the hammer. This is the disconnector, and it's what activates the Sear, and then also is the disconnector so that the gun is just semi-automatic. This is the side plate, which goes over this section right here, which covers this disconnector. That's the screw for the side plate. This is the safety and also the slide holdback latch. It's also the pin that holds the hammer, so it's a multifunction little device. This would be the main recoil spring and the recoil guide rod. That's the firing pin and the firing pin rebound spring. That's to keep it from from accidentally causing a discharge from the firing pin just sliding forward. This is the extractor spring and the extractor plunger, and there's the extractor. And that screw is what holds the firing pin in the slide. This is the slide assembly here. There is a little bit also that wasn't taken apart. There's this little button on the top right here, and there is a flat spring on the inside here, which powers that plunger. That flat spring is also what's used to hold this recoil guide rod back in place. There is a little trick to these. As far as when you disassemble them, if you just remove the assembly and remove the slide without using this takedown plunger, you will likely cause damage to this spring assembly, because what will happen is when you pull the slide back, this spring, which if you notice is longer than the slide, it will start to get away from you, and it will bind and possibly cause damage to itself. If nothing else, there's a good chance it's going to go flying across the room and cause a little bit of a surge. Now, we'll go ahead and put this together in stages. We'll start with the most difficult. So I'm going to be moving everything out of the way here in just a second, and then we'll pull parts in as we move on different sections. The most difficult part of reassembly with this, there's two parts. Whenever you have these long springs, those always present a little bit of a challenge because you have to make sure you get them installed without binding too much. The most difficult part of this particular firearm, however, is this trigger spring, because you have to get this whole assembly into this space here, and it is under spring tension. There's a little trick you can use that makes it fairly easy, so I'll show you that here in just a second, and so we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, let's get everything out of the way that we're not going to be using right away. Like I said, we're going to start with, well, we'll do some simple stuff here. Go ahead and put the plunger in the spring. And that's mostly just so you keep pieces together. Put the firing rebound spring on the firing pin. The extractor plunger and spring, put that together. Then get these other pieces out of the way. This hammer strut and hammer and that pin, we'll go ahead and put those together just because that way they're used as a unit. Pretty straightforward in how they go together. Just knowing what pieces go where is the important part. And move this stuff out of the way. Okay, so we'll start with this here. Now this is the pin that ultimately will be used to hold the trigger in. However, I'm not going to use that right away. That's what a lot of people do. The way this assembly works, this pin goes into the lower hole right there. And this spring goes on that pin, and it fits up into that recess. There is a little notch, which I'll show you here in just a second. There's a little notch right where that spring is set right now. And most people, and it's not necessarily incorrect, will then work to try to put this in place. It's somewhat of a challenge to do that. So here's what I'm going to show you here. I have this little, and there again, this is actually a piece of one of those little bamboo skewers. And I'm using that as a temporary pin. And what it does is it's longer, so it allows you to put this together like so. That holds the spring in place. If the spring falls out of that notch, it keeps everything from flying apart. Otherwise, this spring has a tendency to disappear. And as you can see, it is very small. And so when it bounces away from you, finding it sometimes is a little bit of a challenge. It also allows you to then use this longer piece to go ahead and index into the hole, and that allows you to help guide it in place better. Now, when you put this in, if you notice, the spring, and I don't know if you can see that very well, let me hold it up here. The spring actually extends past the recess where you have to put it in. So that's where using this comes into play, because you can essentially start it in the hole. And you see right now that's actually in the hole without the spring actually being there. And then you can just use another skewer to lift that spring up. And then you can push it down, the whole assembly down. And I know this is a little hard to see, but... And then you can push that into place like so. And you still have this spring here. Now you can go ahead and push that flush. Now the hammer itself is actually in there now. And as you can see, it's got its spring tension. So make sure everything's in place. Now then you push this down. And then you get the actual pin, and you use it to basically push and replace that other piece, and it takes some jiggling. And then that goes into place, and then you push it in. Now this is the part where, okay, once it goes in place, you can check on the other side, and you can see it is in the hole. However, it's not completely flush, and this is where you need a little bit of extra oomph to seat it. So, and then that will seat that in place. And then go ahead and test for function. Okay, that works fine. Now, that spring also goes into this hole on the other side, and that is actually, if you notice on this disconnector, it's got a flat section. That flat section will engage the spring, and if you look in the hole, of course, you'll probably never be able to see this, the spring is kind of flat in that space there. So you will go ahead and push this like that, and then when you turn it down and push it in place, that engages that spring, and if you can see it there, that's under spring tension. Now that is the disconnector. So the way this works, when you pull the trigger, if you watch that disconnector, it'll go back and forth. Now the slide will push that down as it goes back, and that being pushed down, that up and down motion is what will cause it to disconnect from the Sear. And actually I just kind of said it backwards. The slide, when it's closed, will hold that down. When the slide goes back, it opens, that pops up, and then that allows the Sear to then pop forward, and that goes over top of it. and that's what allows it to disconnect from the Sear so that it stays as a semi-automatic. If it didn't do that, what would happen is the Sear would end up engaging all the time, and the hammer, as the slide closed, would release and follow up. It's what's called hammer follow, and it can cause the gun to go ahead and fire. As often as not, it just won't shoot, and then it also won't be cocked. So you pull the trigger, nothing happens. However, it can also cause a point where you pull the trigger and it fires off essentially kind of like a machine gun, except it's not. You don't get that full hammer motion. So generally, it would not reliably fire the cartridge. It's just the gun just won't work. So go ahead and get all that in there. So this part is done for now. So we'll go ahead and put the Sear in next. This is the Sear. Now the way the Sear works, if you notice, there's that very sharp little edge right there. This is the hammer, and the hammer has this little sharp edges too. And that's what basically holds the hammer back. The disconnector, when you pull the trigger, will pull this forward, and that allows the hammer to then come forward and fire. So we'll go ahead and put this Sear in, and it goes right here. That's the pinhole for it. So we'll line this up. Easier said than done. And locate the hole for it. There it is. And then the pin just drops into place. Actually, if I remember correctly, this pin goes through this side. So line it up over here. Once it's lined up, this is where that little pointy bit comes in handy. You can use it to kind of line things up, and then slide the pin in, and that's in place. Okay. Here's the hammer and the strut, and go ahead and line that up. This hole needs to line up with this hole right here. So once that's lined up, then you put this pin in there. And that goes right like so. Now, once that's in place, then you can install this cover plate. And the cover plate holds all of this stuff in. And you don't want to tighten the screw down very far, just kind of snug it up a little bit. Okay, now that we've got the safety, disconnector, or Sear and hammer and trigger installed and the side plate, we'll go ahead and set that aside, and we'll start working on the slide itself. So the first step will be to install the recoil spring. Now, there's two holes in here. There's the one in the center, that's where the firing pin goes, and then there's one on the side here, and that's where the recoil spring goes. Now the spring goes in that hole first, and then you've got the little plunger, and this is where now you just got to kind of guide it in And I know you're not going to be able to see this very well, but so once you kind of have it mostly in, and then it's just a matter of feeding it back in there. And at this point, you might actually have to use something a little bit more substantial. And this position right here, there's where there's a little groove that goes all the way through. That's ultimately where it's going to sit. But now what you need to do is push that plunger all the way in, and then this button here, when you push down, there's a little locking piece that'll then lock it back. So this is where it is handy to have some type of a little tool that you can use to push that back in. And then once you push it all the way in and push that plunger in, there's that little, the spring, it's got a little leaf that goes into the plunger and that holds it in place. And now this is ready to be installed. Well, except for now we got to put in the disconnector and all of that. So the disconnector, you put the spring and plunger in. And if you notice, this has, it's not a completely round, there's a little notch-like section. The round, smooth part goes toward the outside, the flat part goes toward the inside. And at this point, it'll be under spring tension. The extractor, the little hook, goes toward the inside, and basically that little dogleg L-like shape, that'll go into a notch that's inside here. This section right here is what you'll be putting against that plunger. So you'll basically put that in and then push back and keep pushing until it snaps in place, like so. Now the firing pin, it can only go in one way. There's a little notch, and that's what this screw will go through to hold it in place. And if you notice, the notch is bigger than the screw, and that's what gives it its travel to be able to function. So you just put that into the hole, line the notch up, and then you'll push it forward. Here again, use something to line it up. And then screw that into place. Again, it doesn't have to be in there real tight. Okay, now so the slide is all assembled. Now at this point, we'll make sure our hammer strut is up and out of the way. This spring has a little engagement notch, or well, a little tab that will engage into this notch in the back strap. And this curved part of the spring will go onto that sear on the top of it, and that will apply spring pressure to it. So once that's in place, so basically that section will be there, that's the magazine release. Make sure that it's in the notch there. Then you'll push that strut down. Make sure the hammer is forward. If you're not sure, go ahead and pull the trigger so that it comes all the way forward, because you want that strut to be up as far as possible. Now we'll be putting, well, go ahead and put the slide on at this point. Okay. Put the hammer down, then put the slide on. Then push the hammer forward, pull the trigger so that it goes all the way forward. This tab right here goes into a notch on the inside. So you'll be pushing this in place and then pushing against. There. And we're all assembled there. Put the grip panels back on. Now if you notice, it's inletted there, so you want to put it in the correct position. Then ease it forward. Put the spring in place, or the screw. And we're fully assembled. Put the magazine in. And there we go.